Judge, many lawyers, black and white, during your period of law practice were satisfied with just practicing law and staying in their office and doing nothing more. You, though, managed during your growing out period as a lawyer to integrate yourself rather fully in both the organizational bar and in the general community. I want to highlight some of your organizational bar activities. You were active on the federal level with Ann of Court and with the Federal Bar Association even before you joined the bench. But I want to have you highlight probably what I would think is one of your proudest moments as a leader of the Black Bar Association when you were its president around 1979 and had the opportunity of advancing two issues that were very important to the Black Bar of Alabama. One was the bar exam, and a second was the campaign led by black lawyers to get blacks on the federal bench. You led that campaign, and I'm speaking in particular about the campaign to integrate blacks onto the federal judiciary in Alabama. Talk with us a little bit about your role in this state having UW Clement and Myron Thompson ascend to the federal bench in 1980.
That effort actually began on the Federal Judge Nominating Commission, an entity begun by Senators Howell Heflin and Donald Stewart at the time. They decided that for the first time in Alabama, the selection and recommendation of federal judges would not be done in a back room filled with smoke, that it would be done by virtue of a group of citizens meeting. So we did meet, and out of that meeting or those meetings came UW Clement and Myron Thompson. As president at the time of the Alabama Black Lawyers Association, I took an active role in advocating for their confirmation by the Senate, including going to Washington, D.C. and testifying before the Senate in favor of both of those gentlemen. Myron Thompson was less opposed, far less opposed than UW Clement in the state of Alabama. Judge Clement received a lot of opposition in Birmingham, and the American Bar Association opposed him, may even have rated him, as I recall, not qualified. And so it took a lot of advocacy by the Alabama Black Lawyers Association to convince Congress to, and of course along with the help of Senator Heflin, who was on the Judiciary Committee, to get him appointed. We were quite successful, and I was very pleased to have been a part of that.
You were not quite as successful in convincing the Alabama Supreme Court to make major changes in how it administered its bar exam.
No.
Do you recall that?
No, and it wasn't as much of a campaign as the one about which I spoke previously, but we tried to get the Alabama State Bar to institute measures that would assure anonymity. We also tried to get the Alabama State Bar to allow persons who had failed the exam to take it successively until the person passed. I think the rule in place then, it may even prevail now, that once you took the bar exam in July and February of the next year, you could not take it the following July of the second year. You had to wait a whole year, and that's a whole year without being licensed, which was detrimental to the economy of the lawyer trying to gain entry, as well as just professionally detrimental.
As active as you were in your leadership role with the Black Lawyers Association, no one could accuse you of not integrating yourself into the Alabama State Bar or the federal bar at local and state levels. I recall that you were active in the family law section of the state bar.
Yes, yes.
Even
I was chairman of the family law section of the Alabama State Bar in 1985.
And you became a master bencher on the end of court.
Yes.
And an officer in the federal bar.
Yes, and I also served on several Supreme Court committees. I served on the Supreme Court Committee of Judicial Administration and a couple of other committees. I was very active in the state administration of child support enforcement, apart from the actual prosecution.
It was important to you as a lawyer that you didn't relegate yourself to simply being a black lawyer, restricting yourself to black organizations. Is that accurate?
We don't live in a black world.
Yeah.
And if one is going to be competitive, one has to be generally competitive. I have never liked the term, nor have I used the term first black, only black. Mm-hmm. And I have never I try never to evaluate mine or anyone else's achievement in terms of best black or only black. I just think that's a false achievement.
Now, while you were active in all of these legal organizations and with your law practice, you've already alluded to the transition of your father in 1980, but there was another transition that impacted you as well, and that was your divorce in 1979?
Correct.
After which you principally became the custodial parent for your son Reagan.
That's exactly right.
And I believe somewhere while you were still in private practice, your mother sustained a very serious car accident that left her with some impairments.
Yes.
That increased your responsibilities for caring for her and for your two aunts.
Of course.
Okay.
That's correct.
On the brighter side, while you were still in law practice, you met Thomas McPherson and became Vanzetta Penn McPherson.
Yes.
And he also had a career that was compatible with yours, didn't he?
Well, not only compatible, it seemed to have been just intentionally matched. He was the district director of the Atlanta District Office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And
the two of you managed to blend some families that brought Reagan an at-home dad.
Yes.
And brought him, three other siblings?
3 step-siblings, that's correct. A brother and 2 sisters.
And an aunt who was a congresswoman.
Yes. Tom's sister, Eva McPherson Clayton, from the 1st District of North Carolina.
Now, Judge, in addition to being a servant leader in bar organizations, you were challenged to embrace your community. You've already referenced your activities with your church growing up, but when you came back to Montgomery, you changed churches. You remained in the Baptist denomination and moved your membership to Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church, the historic church which had seen Reverend Martin Luther King as its pastor. I think you remained for well over a dozen years and remained quite active there. You chaired the Board of Trustees, you were active with the Social Action Ministry, but there were at least two things that you and your husband Thomas shared in terms of trying to reach out in Dexter, at Dexter to make a difference in the community. Would you comment on those two things?
We were astonished well into our membership at Dexter to find that the parsonage that had housed Martin Luther King Jr. and his family during his 4-year stay in Montgomery had become neglected. It was not in a shambles, but it was deteriorating rapidly, located at 309 South Jackson Street here in Montgomery. And our tourism program at Dexter was at the same time growing. People were coming to the church regularly, but people often asked about where did Dr. King lived. We still owned the parsonage, but we had done nothing with it. So Tom and I set about establishing the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Foundation. as a means of organizing an entity that could oversee the development of the parsonage. We did that. The parsonage opened for business, so to speak, tourism, in November of 2005. It was overseen by the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Foundation. We found many, many historical documents there, which were later cataloged by 2 members of our church. And the parsonage is now a fixture on the Montgomery tourism scene. I curated the parsonage. I went hither, thither, and yon, finding things, period items to place in the parsonage. I didn't have to do too much because, as it happened, the church owned the furniture in the house. So when the Kings left, they did not take the furniture with them. They took their personal belongings. But living room, bedroom, dining room, kitchen furniture was all original to the house, and it remained. So I found artifacts, lamps, rugs, accessories. As I said before, I wanted to be an interior designer. And I had become accustomed to period pieces from having bought and maintained my office in Cottage Hill. So I knew where to go look. And it was both fun and demanding as an undertaking. We had an authentication committee consisting of people at Dexter. They were very helpful, very cooperative. And by the time we opened in November of 2005, we were very proud of our achievement. Tom remained as the on-site manager of the facility until we left Dexter. I was at Dexter from 1982 until 2016.
And as a matter of fact, the tourism ministry continues for the Parsonage Museum.
It does, with the pandemic in mind.
Of course,
it continues.
Of course. The foundation did not fulfill its initial objectives, but both of those were ventures that you and your husband Thomas certainly pursued with enthusiasm. Let me just highlight some of the other things you managed to do in the community while you were still practicing law before you became a judge, so that we have a fuller picture of your self-assessed gift of trying to make a difference. You certainly have been active in promoting youth enrichment for children and promoting the value of education by service on the board of the very YMCAs that helped to nurture you as a child. You've also been active, along with your husband Thomas, in promoting the public library here. I know that you've served on various public school projects and programs. You were part of the cultural arts that focus at Carver, the Center for Performing Arts.
Yes.
And you have been active in promoting political literacy through organizations such as the AAUW and the League of Women Voters.
Yes, I have.
And on a broader level, one of your continuing affiliations is with the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. You've been on that board how long now?
Since God said, "Let there be light." Actually, I've been on the board on and off since 1987. I've been affiliated with ASF for that long. And it's one of my favorite projects.
The love of music that you cultivated as a child led you to join the board of the city's symphony, and you've been on the statewide council on the arts. You've also been much more persistent than many in trying to promote in this city opportunities to foster interracial friendships, dialogue, and improvements through more sustained relationships between the races. You alluded to the Todd Road incident as one that promoted such organizations when none had existed before. What are some of the organizations in that connection that you spent a good deal of time on before you became a judge?
The most concrete organizational derivative of Todd Road was Leadership Montgomery, begun in 1980, begun in 1983.
You were a member of the first
1985,
class,
sorry,
weren't you?
1985. I was a member of the first of Class 1 of Leadership Montgomery. It was followed by One Montgomery, Leadership Alabama, and other such organizations designed to foster, to provide, as I said, an avenue for interracial conversations.
And it continues today.
It does.
Yeah. Now, talk about audacity. While you were still in solo practice, still active in bar organizations and associations, still active in trying to foster organizations in Montgomery which bettered the civic life, and still rearing a child and educating a child, you have the audacity to become an entrepreneur and establish with me a bookstore in Montgomery that lasted from 1989 until the year 2000. I know there's not much time to talk about the vision and the planning and the realization of the dream, but let me just have you succinctly give us a retrospective on that project and how it mattered to this city and how it mattered to you.
Ever since I was a child, I've loved books. My house as a child was just filled with books, and I would sit in a corner and just read. I taught my son to do the same thing, and he does it to this day. And so, as an adult, it didn't take long, even with the chain bookstores, for us to figure out that there just weren't enough books about our experiences available to the public, including books in public libraries and university libraries. So we decided to open a bookstore. And sometimes I think of Roots and Wings and the motivation behind it as the face of a clock. And I go from 1 to 12, and I denominate each number with a description of how we did it and why we did it, and give each one of the numbers names like risky. You use audacious. Prescient is another one of my words that I use to assign to those numbers. Roots and Wings was as much a cultural and social endeavor as it was a commercial endeavor. I am not ashamed to acknowledge that it achieved much more in the first two than it did the latter. It drew many people to a black bookstore. It was the first, and during the time that it existed, the only, and since its closure, the only African American book place in Montgomery, Alabama. But more than a bookstore, it was a book forum, because central to our existence was bringing authors to Montgomery to share their experiences, read from their books, and enlighten otherwise the public that came to see them. People like Alice Walker, Toni Cade Bambara, John Hope Franklin, the preeminent historian of America and Southern America in particular. Alex Haley, who penned Roots, that resulted in a 7-part miniseries, which at its time, 1977, was the most watched program on television. We brought lesser known people like Gloria Gales, and we brought well-known people internationally like Johnny Cochran to Montgomery to sign books, to talk, to share, and to see Montgomery in a different light. And I do believe we made a contribution in that regard as well. So the experience of owning and operating Roots and Wings just completely broadened our perspectives, and Tom's as well. He was as much a participant in that endeavor as we were. It also helped us to envision programs for children. We didn't achieve all of our objectives, but one of our more important objectives, especially as I look back on it, was the Language Institute, the program that we developed for young children to come in on Saturdays and not just sit and talk about books, but to learn how to think, learn how to analyze, and learn how to master and utilize, and I emphasize utilize, this beautiful language we speak. Because it isn't just an organ of communication. It's a vehicle for transferring emotion in different ways. So that endeavor was the endeavor of Roots and Wings is just a major part of my life. One that has enduring consequences. And of course, a practical consequence was that it gave my son a job.
I was just about to add that we cannot leave out your son as an integral part of the staff at Roots and Wings.
Yes.
Nor can we overlook our intended consequence of having in the city of Montgomery a place which welcomed blacks and whites to experience African American history and culture.
By means of the books and by means of discussion.
And by means of the authors, many of whom were also white authors,
Yes.
Like Virginia Durr and Morris Dees. Now, during the period of Roots and Wings, though, you had an opportunity you could not refuse. When you were growing up here, you never envisioned being a lawyer. You've acknowledged, and I suspect that you certainly did envision being a judge.
No.
While you were at Howard and Columbia, I don't think being a judge was on your horizon either.
No,
is that right?
it was not.
So why was it the right time for you to leave law practice in 1992, and how is it that you got the challenge to become a federal magistrate judge?
While becoming a judge was not on my list of things to do in college or during the earlier parts of my practice, as my practice developed, I did think about becoming a judge. I thought about it because of its discipline, the way that it disciplines the judge and the way the judge helps to discipline the courtroom environment. And I thought about it because I enjoyed writing, and that's what federal judges do as opposed to state court judges. The opportunity came to me at a judicial conference at the Grove Inn in Asheville, North Carolina, where one of the magistrate judges advised me that there was a vacancy that was pending in our district, and he encouraged me to apply. That magistrate judge was John Carroll, who was then the chief magistrate judge here in Montgomery. Seated at our table was the Venerable Solomon C., who joined John in encouraging me. I couldn't turn down both of them, hardly, so I did apply, and I pursued the position, and in April of the following year, 1992, I was appointed.
You were appointed as the result of a merit selection process that was statutorily prescribed.
Oh yes,
Right.
Magistrate judges are not political appointees like district judges, and nor are they lifetime appointees.
Do you recall the number of people against whom you competed?
I was advised that there were approximately 50 applicants.
And you remained on the bench as a magistrate judge for about 15 years. I know that one of your greatest joys as a magistrate judge was acquiring the opportunity to have and to mentor law clerks. And it is certainly every judge's dream to have a law clerk emulate himself or herself by becoming a judge.
Yes.
let me allow you the privilege of commenting on the joy you experienced just this year in seeing one of your former law clerks become a federal judge.
I hired Jerusha Adams, who was Jerusha Smith at the time, in 1994. She served as my law clerk for 2 years, as did all the others. And she later remained in Montgomery. She was from Michigan. She later remained in Montgomery, pursuing opportunities in the U.S. Attorney's Office and later in private practice. I was very, very proud to be a speaker at her investiture in February of this year, 2020, when she was sworn in as a U.S. Magistrate judge.
And you've also maintained contacts with all of your law clerks. How many were you able to mentor?
I had approximately 11 law clerks. I started off hiring law clerks for 1 year, and then I moved to 2 years.
And in addition to making a difference with those clerks, what difference do you think is attributed to you by being on the court from the perspective of the folk who worked within the court, whether they were your colleagues as judges or members of the various members of the courthouse family, janitors, marshals, probation officers? What was the perception and what was the reality about the difference you made coming on the court when you did? And I suppose for historical context, while neither of us relishes being relegated to the first black woman to do anything, you brought to the bench, your presence on the bench represented the first time a woman had graced this federal bench, and also the first time a black had been a magistrate judge on this bench. What difference did it make? Or what difference did you try to make, whether you can measure it or not?
I think it made a difference because I was female, and most of the male auxiliary personnel in the building were most of the auxiliary personnel in the building were males. The court security officers, the probation officers, the people who worked in the clerk's office were about half and half male and female. The marshals were male. And so they had to adjust to regarding a female as a judge. They had to adjust to that. That was called for or warranted. And I'm sure that was helpful in pushing them toward imposing an egalitarian point of view on women in charge. Also, the young women who worked in the clerk's office, they were accustomed to all the judges being men. And I think my being on the bench, and I don't want to overstate it, I really don't, but I feel comfortable saying that with respect to at least 5 or 6 of them, my being on the bench humanized them. They were more than just deputy clerks. They became people by name, and they became entities unto themselves. Obviously, being women, they could talk to me and say things to me as another woman that they just simply wouldn't say to a man. I could say things to other men that I could say things to a man that another man couldn't say. I could say things to litigants and law clerks that male judges couldn't say. At least one judge on this court told me more than once that he simply would not comment on a woman's dress, even if he thought it inappropriate. I did. Being female, and I suppose in part being me, I had no compunction about telling women that they were inappropriately dressed or calling them into my chambers and correcting some part of what they were doing. I had a woman once wear slides to my courtroom, and I sent her out before I even heard her case to put on some shoes. I don't think a man would have been comfortable doing that. Now, I'm not trumpeting that as hoorah, that's great, but I say it to emphasize that diversity doesn't always, but diversity of personnel can bring about additional order to an environment.
And as the word was then and remains, that you had a standard in your courtroom, that is, that you enforced a behavioral standard, a standard of preparedness by the lawyer. I believe that's something you're proud of, isn't it?
I'm very proud of that, because I think that there always has to be a reserve of civility. And with all due respect, I didn't see that reserve of civility in state court. And lawyers knew that when they came to federal court, there were rules. You didn't address the court unless you stood. That's just what you did. I probably had some additional rules in my courtroom that were based on my own sense of civility growing out of childhood. One of them, quite simply, was that I just simply didn't allow people to drink water out of a bottle. I just didn't think when you were examining a witness, you should pause and pick up a bottle and turn it upside down to your face while you were examining a witness. So I simply didn't permit it. I didn't mind people having water at the table, but there were just certain lines that you just didn't cross. And I think that's very helpful. I think there always must be a reserve of decorum. I think it adds credibility to the process, and it increases one's reliance on the formality of the process. And it removes any aspect of, it doesn't remove it, it certainly reduces the imprimatur of partiality or considerations that aren't related to the case at hand.
Well, your judicial decorum and your personality as a judge will certainly be part of your legacy here in the Middle District. But you managed over a 15-year term also to establish a standard in how you handled and disposed of the substantive work of a magistrate judge, which during the course of your 15 years evolved. When you look back over your casework legacy as a federal magistrate judge, what are you proudest of?
Are you talking cases or just in general?
Both.
Okay. The one thing I am proudest of is working with law clerks and chamber personnel to bring about what I always regarded and always tried to effect as a reasonable and just conclusion to cases. I enjoyed conversing with law clerks. I enjoyed the banter, especially when they took an opposing point of view. I enjoyed having them convince me. It was a tug of war when we disagreed. And so I enjoyed that aspect of it. I enjoyed what I thought was the credibility that I brought to judicial proceedings for litigants, including defendants who came into court. As I said when we were discussing my college experience or my high school experience, I don't remember which one, there is less room to believe that anything untoward is happening when you and the arbiter or the decider look alike and presumably have the same experiences. And at the same time, there is more hope that that arbiter, being the judge, can identify with your personal experiences. I said when I spoke at Judge Thompson's investiture in 1980 that Judge Thompson was ripe professionally for this court because he will have walked in the shoes of the people who appeared before him. So I think it was important for the people appearing before me at least to believe that I had walked in their shoes, or at least was capable of doing so. So I enjoyed that. From a casework standpoint, I enjoyed two cases because they resemble cases I had handled as a lawyer, a practicing lawyer. One was the Shuford case. That was the case brought against the Alabama Post-Secondary, the Alabama Department of Post-Secondary Education, on behalf of women who had not been promoted as they should have been in junior and community colleges in Alabama. I was very proud of that case. It was a lawsuit that probably needed to have been brought. It was well handled by both sides. It resulted in a finding, not by me because I was a magistrate judge, but I did prepare a recommendation that the women prevail in their claims. The other claim that the other case, which of course resembled the kind of case I handled as a lawyer, was the Austin case. The Austin case is known as the hitching post case. It was the case that challenged the Alabama State Department of Corrections practice of literally hitching inmates to a post in cross-like posture for hours at a time as a penalty for misdoings or misconduct. And it was cruel and unusual, as I recommended that it was cruel and unusual. The men offered testimony that can only be described as awful, horrible. The Alabama Department of Corrections was then being investigated by the United States Justice Department for those practices. Alabama at the time, I think, was one of 2 or 3 states that still had a hitching post. The hitching post was imposed for serious misdeeds by prisoners, such as fighting and contraband, drugs and other contraband, but also imposed for misdeeds as innocuous as reporting to the breakfast late or not having a clean cell. Not that contraband was there, but just simply not having a clean cell. The ugliest part of the process of assigning to the hitching post was that there were no rules. It was entirely subjective. And any officer could decide that any infraction deserved hitching an inmate to a post. Inmates, and I don't mean to go on, but as I said, the testimony was horrible. Inmates stayed so long during those hours at a time that they defecated on themselves. They were in the hot sun for 4 to 6 hours. One wonders how the state or any other entity could regard that as humane.
And even so, our state is still grappling with how it treats its incarcerated, but for sure you can be proud of your contribution at that time to forcing the eradication of this horribly unconstitutional practice. Clearly you found fulfilling the work of a magistrate judge, which did evolve considerably during your 15 years. You were reappointed after your first term ended in 2000, and you were about to complete a second term when you decided to retire on October 31, 2006. I would be remiss if I did not ask you if during the course of your service as a federal magistrate judge, which is a merit selection appointment, you had any aspirations to be an Article III lifetime judge.
Of course.
And did you act on any of those aspirations during that time?
I did. I made known to judges here, that is Article III judges here, as well as Alabama's senators at the time, my desire to be appointed or recommended for appointment as an Article III judge. So yes, I acted on that desire.
And it just wasn't in the political cards for you at the time?
It wasn't in the political cards for me at the time.
And your decision to...
although I was puzzled by that fact, because one avenue for becoming an Article III judge was appointment to a brand new position as an Article III judge, rather than replacing someone who had retired or resigned.
And still, you were not a choice, or that vacancy was never filled?
Not while I was on the bench.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, it was. Yes, it was. That vacancy was filled, but I was not a choice.
Mm-hmm. What went into your decision to retire when you did?
I thought that, I believed that I had reached the end of the learning curve. I am a strong believer that time has to be wisely used. And the prudence of remaining a magistrate judge for longer than I had been, in my mind, was dim. So that was one of the reasons. I also believed that I should have been appointed an Article III judge, and failing that, I was not prepared just to stick around to say that I was a judge. I also had a third phase I wanted to enter.
And let's get to that third phase. You retire on October 31, 2006, and that's an appropriate end to your growing out phase, but you still have something left to grow on. Let's remind you of how you define this third trimester, so to speak. This is what you wrote. Now that we are growing on, we have uncovered some very pleasant surprises. Surprises that remind us of the gender dichotomies we encountered during our growing out phase. You know the ones. A man is firm, a woman is stubborn, a man is aggressive, a woman is pushy. Similarly, the inflexibility we saw in our parents suddenly became our firmness. They were nostalgic for the past. We respect history. They were cheap. We are frugal. They were intransigent. We cherish tradition. They spoiled our children. We merely want our grandchildren to have what they deserve. For the most part, however, we don't need to rationalize growing on. In so many ways, it is life's most contented phase. Freed from uncertainty about who we are, we take comfort in being ourselves for ourselves. We know where life's landmines are and thus how to avoid them. Judge, you moved into your growing on years with a plan. And I recall that one of the most fundamental aspects of your plan was to be free to speak out and express yourselves. And that vehicle you found as a newspaper columnist for the Montgomery Advertiser, starting in July of 2007 and continuing until this year, just in May, writing a bi-monthly column touching on local and national issues of race, cultural, and politics. You did that for 13 years. What was your objective, and when you decided to move on this May, how do you assess whether it was worth the energy and the fans and the hate mail?
Contrary to popular belief, the column and my decision to write it were not designed either specifically or conclusively to express myself, but rather to plant thoughts on the public terrain to see what would blossom. My mother was an avid publisher of things, and she always added when she started it, "What is your thinking?" While I did not repeat that practice, I wanted to give the public two things. One, something to think about, and two, a different way to think about it. So I began writing the column to express that point of view, because we hadn't had that in Montgomery. We hadn't had columnists in Montgomery when I began writing in 2007 in quite a long time, though the Advertiser has had some remarkable, the Montgomery Advertiser that is, has had some remarkable columnists, but those columnists weren't writing about me. They weren't writing about my family, my experiences. And they weren't writing about how those two cities that I talked about merge. They weren't writing about the common interests of those two cities and how those two cities had coexisted and must now coexist in the future. So, and I love writing. I love the language. So I wrote for those reasons.
And you were provocative.
Some have said that I was, yes.
And you had planned that to be your primary outlet, but I know that you managed also to express yourself in other venues, including a national magazine for your husband's fraternity, the Boulay Journal.
Yes. I began writing a column for the Boulay Journal in 2000, I think it was 2008. And I stopped writing that column a few years thereafter, after my husband was diagnosed with after my husband's diagnosis of prostate cancer eventuated into a disease. And I did not resume writing for the Boulay Journal until 2019.
And you continue to write today.
Yes.
In your post-bench growing on period, you've not abandoned your interest in trying to lift people in the community to higher ground. You have mentored inmates in the city jail, creating an experience you described as lessons in living, an interpersonal conferencing and journaling event. I think you also tried to mentor some public school students with mixed results. That didn't keep you from trying.
No.
You've spoken out a lot through commencement speeches at high schools and colleges and a number of public programs and events. And you didn't completely abandon lawyering. For a time, you returned in quasi-judicial roles as a contract hearing officer in 2007, investigating administrative appeals from Birmingham firefighters who were challenging various forms of discipline. You were...
That did occur about a year or two after I left the bench.
And I think also you were appointed by more than one court to investigate some ongoing race discrimination claims. Where were those?
The first appointment was on the recommendation of plaintiff's counsel in a case, a class action in Indianapolis, Indiana. The court, in its decision, included the establishment of an oversight committee. Oversight committees were not uncommon following successful class actions. The function of that committee was to oversee the settlement and the consent decree that issued. And the highlight of that experience was getting to work with two phenoms in the law. One of them was Judge Nathaniel Jones, who had been general counsel of the NAACP and who ultimately became a judge on the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Highly respected man. The other was the opportunity to work with Abner Mikva, the renowned judge of the Washington, D.C. District Court. And aside from that, we did oversight. So I really enjoyed that experience. It lasted only about 2 years, was truncated by the fact that the company against which the judgment was entered went out of business for the purpose of ending the consent decree. The second was an appointment by Judge Linwood Smith in the Northern District of Alabama to analyze the conduct of the receiver who had been appointed to implement the consent decree that eventuated after Jefferson County black employees filed race discrimination class claims against Jefferson County.
Okay. Now, these limited forays into the law must have convinced you that you didn't want to return to law practice, because you never did.
They did. I didn't anyway, but doing that certainly sealed the game for me.
Instead, you found yourself many avenues within the community to still make a difference. And just mentioning a few, you have maintained your interest in the cultural arts. You've not only continued service on the board of the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, but you were active on the Alabama Educational Television Foundation. And within the community, you certainly have been on a number of boards, the Landmarks Foundation, you've been on bank boards, many of the civic leaders tours sponsored here locally by either the Air University or Hyundai. And most recently, you have been called upon to support the mayors of this city. You want to come in on that foray?
Well, quite unexpectedly, the newly elected mayor of Montgomery, Stephen Reed, in November of 2008, 1 month after his election, asked me to co-chair the transition committee, the transition team, which consisted of 6 committees. We did that in meetings from November through February of this year. We issued our report in June of this year. The report was delayed, as were many other things, by the pandemic. But I believe that the report had soundness and credibility and obvious usefulness, because since its issuance, the mayor has implemented many of its recommendations.
And you and Thomas tried to take our public library to higher ground with a project called Questplex.
Yes,
that
we did.
Though it did not find fruition, took a considerable amount of your volunteered and his volunteered time.
I was the helper in that quest. Tom was a longtime chairman of the board of the Montgomery City County Public Library. And I was his helper. I was his typist. I was the person against whom he bounced ideas. And together we tried to bring Questplex, a combination of both a physical and a conceptual combination of the library and a children's museum to our city. Our efforts were not successful, but it was a good effort, and it still resulted in vast, significant improvements to the Montgomery City County Public Library.
To keep you with your modicum of humility, let me just conclude this portion of your community service by relating the fact that you have been the recipient of a number of significant awards intended to underscore that you have indeed been a servant leader in this city. You've been a senior of achievement, recognized by the community of the Montgomery Area Council on Aging. You've been recognized as a woman of achievement. You've received all sorts of leadership awards, probably none that was as meaningful as being recognized in 2015 for your overall commitment to service, almost a Citizen of the Year award by the Montgomery Sunrise Rotary Club. Would that be accurate in characterizing the meaningfulness of that award?
That award was meaningful in the narrow context of civic achievement. But would you really like to know my favorite title?
What's your favorite title? Is Mommy?
Grandmommy.
Well, we're going to get to Grandmommy after I at least relate for the future generations that you are sitting now for an oral history, but that you are one of the people selected in 2007 to sit for the nation's largest African American video oral history collection called The History Makers. Yes. And there you have told your story in in greater detail, and this will be a permanent repository. Let's move into your family life as part of your growing on period when you acquired another title of grandmommy. I cannot, I don't want to overlook the part or the value to you of travel with your family, alone, with your husband. You've been one who I know I've heard say frequently that travel is an essential part of education.
It is
and
education.
You, Thomas, and your son Reagan and his wife, you, Thomas, your grandchildren, your son and daughter, you alone, you with civic leaders, your record for global travel during your growing on phase, not to mention domestic travel, is significant. I don't know that there's a continent you've not visited, save Australia, maybe
Australia and Antarctica, and I ain't going to Antarctica.
Talk though for a minute about how your quality of life has been enhanced in this growing on period by your travels.
Just as I said to you that when I went to Howard, one of the discoveries I made was that you're not nearly as smart as you think you are. When one travels abroad, one gains a sense of being an even smaller pebble on the beach than one initially thought. We happen to live in a country that is perceived as the leader of the world. And we grow up believing that. And that belief is not without some justification. But when you go abroad, you realize that millions of people live their lives in utter disregard of what we do or say. You also understand that there are cultural advantages that not only do we not have, but that we are never likely to achieve, such as being not only bilingual, but multilingual. The ability to communicate with people across country lines, and therefore to appreciate the way they live and their culture and their history is invaluable in the march toward human progress. Rather than, as Americans do, always evaluating other countries in light of ourselves, and most of the times concluding that they're worse off than we are. So that is a value that I've gotten out of travel. Another value I've gotten out of travel is just seeing the things that you read about. When you turn on a television and the reporter is talking about something that happened in Beijing, as is often the case, it helps to have been to Beijing. It helps to visualize what that reporter is saying. When the reporter says that there are so many billions of people, it's helpful to remember that when you were in Beijing, sometimes you couldn't see the buildings for the people, because it truly is just unbelievably crowded. So travel is itself an education, and I have never minded taking my son out of school to travel, because I believed at the time that he got much more out of the trips we made than he would have gotten in those 1 or 2 days he spent in school.
And probably during the entirety of his high school, college years, you were able to travel as a family almost every year.
Oh yes, we did. It was very important for us to do that. It's important to leave home to understand that there's a world beyond that is not governed by your home rules.
Favorite destinations internationally?
Venice.
And
always Venice.
And in the States? What's most surprising, I suspect, is your obsession with national parks.
I know, and people will find this so camp, but aside from New York, which really is up there as number one, the place that I could go back again and again and again. The next place I could really go back and enjoy is Mount Rushmore. I just enjoyed it. It is such a physical spectacle that you don't appreciate unless you stand there and look at it before your very eyes.
As travel has continued to bring you contentment during your growing on years, your family has continued to suffer inevitable transitions, but also to expand, so to speak. You lost your mother, I believe, in 2010. You lost your aunts not soon thereafter, but you were free to nurture and discover a relationship with another sister.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. I had discovered her earlier, but I began to nurture a relationship with a child that my father fathered before he met my mother. Her name is Betty Bryant, and I have visited her many times, or several times, in West Palm Beach where she lives, and she has visited me.
And she's older.
Yes.
And your older brother, Ojeda, whatever became of him?
Well, he lives in Atlanta, where he has lived for decades. He is a retired junior college professor, and if you asked him what he does, he'd tell you he's a jazz pianist, because that's what he is.
And your younger brother, Wilbur?
My younger brother, Wilbur, lives in Dallas, Texas, and he has worked for Nielsen, trying to figure out what people are listening to, watching, and want to see for years and years and years.
And now to my loving godson, your only child, Reagan, who suffered through Roots and Wings, who suffered through every venture that Mommy had, who suffered through all of the ups and downs of her law practice, for whom she sacrificed to provide a first-class education. How has God's son and your son, Reagan, fulfilled your Mommy's dreams?
Well, he actually suffered through Lily Ashton, one of our favorite boutiques.
Needless to say, so that the record is clear, dearest Reagan was often the one to accompany us on quite a number of shopping trips, and he did so as a loving child.
He did.
On a higher level.
On a higher level.
Became of Reagan.
He followed his mommy to Howard University and graduated magna cum laude in 1996. Then, having already decided that he wanted to be a physician, he went just 45 miles east to Johns Hopkins Med School. Graduated in 2000, and he was even more of a perpetual student than I was, because he left Johns Hopkins and went to Harvard to pursue a master in public health, and finally, he returned to Alabama to practice, and he is now an associate professor at UAB Med School.
And he did not return to Alabama alone.
No, he did not, because at Hopkins, he met his life partner, my daughter-in-law, Nefertiti Durant, who is from Baltimore. They went to Harvard together, and she secured a Master of Public Health as well. They did their residency at Duke Hospital, and Duke University Hospital, and so they both moved to Birmingham in 2006. And they have gifted me with the most wonderful 2 grandchildren, ages 13 and 10.
A daughter and a son?
A granddaughter who's 13, Morgan, and a grandson, Cullen, who is now 10.
And grandparenting is a special joy for you.
Absolutely. I feel like I was, I interned with my grandmothers, both of them, my father's mother and my mother's mother, and I was inadvertently taught how to be a grandmother. And So by the time I had grandchildren, it was an experience that I coveted and therefore welcomed. It has been one of the 3 most eye-opening experiences of my life.
And what were the other 2?
Oh, definitely leaving home and marrying.
And it is in part, or in substantial part, the love of your grandchildren which has helped to sustain you since the loss of your loving Thomas last year.
Absolutely.
In 2019.
Yes.
In June. Many would be surprised that some of the things which continue to sustain you now were habits that you, or patterns that you were rooted in during your own childhood. You've mentioned more than once your penchant for interior decorating. That's extended to almost an obsession with table setting and celebrating holidays.
Oh yes.
And
that is both a kindergarten overlay and a kindergarten vestige.
And celebrating holidays was special to you during your childhood.
Absolutely. We celebrated all holidays and we decorated.
Judge, it's time for us to think about your legacy here as we prepare to close your interview. There have been some themes or defining values that have been consistent from my perspective. They've been clearly evident undercurrents throughout your life, whether in your growing up years, your growing out years, or your growing on years. And as we conclude this oral history, I'm going to invite you to speak on them as I identify them, because I want to tie it in to your initial assessment of your gift to God. Here's my conclusion. Your life's journey in every trimester has been highlighted by substantial evidence of your personal commitment to the same values you pledged fidelity to when you were inducted into the National Honor Society way back in high school. Those would be scholarship, leadership, character, and service. You have been consistent in embracing these values as a parent, as a mentor, as a role model, a lawyer, a judge, a bookstore owner, a frequent speaker, and a widely published writer on matters of public concern. Your viewpoints have been valued, they've been solicited, they've been widely disseminated. So it's somewhat appropriate that I conclude this interview by inviting you to assess the current status of these values within the audiences and the venues you targeted, and to identify the challenges remaining and your hopes or visions for those who might be inspired by your words and deeds. Let me start with scholarship, and I'm going to do it in the context of what you announced at the outset when you were describing your gift to God, and again after your growing up years. You've talked about having a yen for excellence, which is certainly a basic foundation of your exposure in the community and in the at home and in school. Where are we today as a country, as a city, as families, in instilling the foundations for that overall component of scholarship, that is a thirst for learning with a yen for excellence? And where can we be? What's your challenge?
We are well behind where we were even 30 years ago. not to mention 40 years ago, which was 1980. Today, commitment to scholarship is lacking due to so many things. In my judgment, the chief one of which is modern technology. Scholarship is not just achieving an outcome, it's traveling a path. I absolutely adore the little things we hold in our hands that give us instant outcomes. I often say I don't know how I lived without my cell phone. I know that I did. But simultaneous with providing us with access to information, those devices have chilled our embracement of the learning process. So all we want today, and I speak generically of us as a collective in America, all we want today is the answer. And we are either not concerned with or minimally concerned with how you get there. And because scholarship is a function of two things, we are repressed in our achievement of scholarship.
I suspect your assessment of character education, whether at home, in the community, or in the school, is similar. And you would conclude that the deficiency is woeful.
In character?
Yes.
The deficiency is, I wouldn't say it's woeful, and I'll tell you why. It's certainly remarkable, but it's complicated. It's more complex than in my judgment. It's more complex. We are living in a society now, due in large measure to this technology that I've been talking about and this instant access to information. We are living in a society now where people devalue expertise. And they certainly devalue the expertise that they don't have, because they believe that with these devices at their disposal, they are as expert as anyone else, which is why we have an anesthesiologist or radiologist leading a public health initiative in Washington. Mm-hmm. And so we are now living in a society where everyone thinks his opinion about anything is as valuable as anybody else's opinion about anything. I think I can have a legal opinion that's due some respect, but I can't have an opinion about plumbing or an electrical outlet or a video taping of an event that's worth as much as the people who do that.
I'm going to combine the last two values, leadership and service, for the sake of brevity, and ask only this pointed question: what is your challenge to lawyers and judges and professionals and citizens who don't believe that they are obliged to go beyond their narrow careers, who don't see themselves as having a role to be of service beyond themselves, as you have been?
I suppose that if I started a conversation, I'd start with faith without works is nothing. It's an adage, biblical as it is, with which most people are familiar. It's like having it's like having the latest Ferrari off the assembly line and no gasoline in the tank. So what? So my challenge is that regardless of your expertise, your ability, if you are not actualizing it to help better your own life or the life of your family and fellow human beings, it's for naught. It may as well not exist.
And in that same connection, the bulk of your career in your growing out years and your avocations in your growing on years has been characterized by being a fierce advocate against accepting discrimination in any form, and instead actively confronting the need in America to continue confronting our history of racism as a core generational problem. We don't have time for all of your wisdom on what needs to be done to deal with the racial divides that still appear sometimes irreconcilable and all the issues that are there. But if you could succinctly give a challenge to anyone interested in picking up that mantle of fighting discrimination in all forms, let me give you the opportunity to share that.
It has to start with acknowledgement. The country's seminal and most enduring social issue has to be addressed by acknowledgement. It has to be acknowledged as the country's seminal and most enduring social issue. But it also has to be understood. Acknowledgement is first, and understanding is second. And understanding can happen only as a result of reading and studying. We can't make assumptions about what has happened. And we can't do so always in an atmosphere of angst. It has to be done in an atmosphere of emotional neutrality.
Judge, I really want to thank you. I suppose first I want to thank the architect of this oral history project. I believe that was Judge Thompson, now senior district judge, and all involved for ensuring that you would be included in this project and for allowing me the privilege of conducting this interview. And expressing my gratitude to you, I'm going to borrow, with her permission, an expression of gratitude our mutual friend Georgette Norman penned to you after reading one of your columns several years ago. For the sake of history, Georgette was the first director of the Troy University's Rosa Parks Museum in downtown Montgomery. Here's what she said: "I want to thank you for your wisdom, critical analysis, and valiant and forthright willingness to shine a bright light on the realities of black, brown, tan, and beige life on this little blue marble we call Earth." That sounds like Georgette,
it
doesn't
does.
it? And to her pithy affirmation, I can only add, to be sure the entirety of your life has been a shining star which should inspire and guide generations untold to live their lives on higher ground. I'm grateful to have been a close eyewitness to that journey, but as usual, in deference to your age, I must give you the last word. We started this oral history by recalling your favorite quote. And anyone who's been privileged to know your growing up and growing out journey also knows you have a favorite poem. I'm not going to have you recite it.
No.
What I Live For. But I am going to, without forewarning, because I'm confident that you know it, ask you to declare the last stanza of What I Live For.
I'm really glad you asked me that, because when you framed the previous discussion in scholarship, leadership, character, and service, while it was useful, it it was preceded as what I guess I would say the cartography of my life begins with what I live for. A poem that all of my classmates and I had to learn in the 6th grade, as did everyone else who passed through Miss Gilchrist's 6th grade. It shaped my life's thinking, and the last stanza in particular. I live for those who love me, for those who know me true, for the heaven that smiles above me and awakes my spirit too, for the cause that lacks assistance, for the wrong that needs resistance, for the future in the distance, and the good that I can do.
Judge, thank you for living your life in the manner that you have. And congratulations on that journey.
Thank you.